Hey there, welcome to Geeky Greenhouse. In today's video, I'll talk all about succession planting your garden veggies. Succession planting is one of the great ways to get more out of your garden and avoid wasted space and wasted fresh produce. So in this video, I'll show you how to succession plant your garden veggies with some important tips to keep in mind. Also, some of the crops that are best suited for succession planting and how this can lead to more fresh produce out of your garden. So first off, what is succession planting? Essentially, it's the process of planting the same crop multiple times throughout the season to end up with a more evenly distributed harvest of that crop throughout the year. For example, instead of planting all of your bush beans on the same day and ending up with a huge harvest a couple of months later, you can spread out those plantings throughout the course of a few weeks or even a couple of months and end up with more even, smaller harvests throughout the year. I don't know about you, but I like to come out into the garden every night during the summer and see what's ripening up, grab a small harvest for dinner that night, and that way we don't have to worry about preserving any of our excess produce. Some other benefits of succession planting other than those smaller harvests are also that you save space in the garden, so when one plant comes out, like this large head of lettuce, we can immediately replace it with a smaller one, plugging that into the garden, saving at least a couple of weeks of growth progress. It also leads to much less waste because when you have a huge harvest, it can be very easy to let some of that go to waste if you don't know how to preserve it or what to do with it. Another thing to keep in mind is if you want to sell your produce at farmers markets or maybe to local restaurant owners, succession planting is key to making sure you have a fresh supply of produce all summer long. Now, before we get into the simple method of succession planting, I want to talk about some of the veggies that are best suited for this technique. Now, it's not necessary for all vegetables, especially things that naturally produce a regular harvest. Things like indeterminate tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, these plants all naturally produce regular yields from their plants. When you harvest one batch of fruits, another one will be on its way shortly. This is also true of cut and come again veggies, things like kale or Swiss chard, where you remove a few leaves and more leaves replace them. But that doesn't mean you can't try it. If you do live in a warmer climate, you can try succession planting determinate tomatoes and shorter season peppers. It really is up to you, and I highly recommend experimenting. But here are some of my favorite veggies for succession planting. First off is lettuce. This is the example I'll be using today. You can see these huge heads of lettuce that are ready to be harvested, and we've been picking them and eating them. We have another round behind them that is slightly smaller and isn't quite ready for harvest. And then we also have these, which were planted a couple weeks ago and are ready to be plugged into the ground. Other leafy greens are great as well, such as spinach. You can also do this with cabbages. Carrots and beets are also great for this. Carrots especially, because you can do this pretty much throughout the summer, all the way until mid or late summer, and you'll get your last harvest of carrots right around when winter arrives, and those tend to be the tastiest carrots of all. Peas and other cool season crops are also great for succession planting because they do well in the shoulder months, and you can try to make the most out of them and get regular harvests during the cooler periods. Speaking of the shoulder months and especially fall, if you want to try planting for a fall harvest, we have a useful guide over on geekygreenhouse.com that will help you understand exactly when to sow your seeds for that fall harvest. I'll leave that in a link in the description. Also, bush beans, like I mentioned, and most herbs, but especially those that tend to bolt, like basil and cilantro, so you can get the best taste from those herbs. If you live in a warmer climate with a longer season, you can succession plant things like cucumbers and even determinate tomatoes that will give you one big harvest all at once. Just make sure that you have enough season left in the year to get those yields. So now, how do you succession plant your veggies? It's really pretty simple. The most important thing is to plan on a certain interval of planting and plant those seeds every 1 week, 2 weeks, or even 3 weeks, depending on how much of that veggie you'll need. So for lettuce, we tend to plant 6 plants every 2 weeks. We usually go through about 6 heads of lettuce. We try to at least every 2 weeks during this time of year. So when we harvest one of these big heads here, we can immediately replace it with one of these or another plant that needs to get into the garden. Some plants need a bit of a wider interval, maybe you don't use them as much, or maybe they need longer to mature. And you can also think about adjusting the number of plants that you're succession sowing to suit your needs and make sure that you have enough space in the garden for it and that you're not planting more of that veggie than you'll actually need. But I'll say generally we stick to a 2-week interval regardless of what we're planting, and then we just adjust the number of plants to make sure that we can use that number of plants in about 2 weeks. Now, some tips for succession planting. I highly recommend transplanting if you can. Sow them in 6-cell trays like this out of the garden. You're saving space in the garden that would otherwise be taken up. These seedlings took about 2 weeks to get to this level, and that's just a waste of time for something that needs about 1 square foot in the garden. You can get the plants to this stage off-site and then bring them into the garden when the space is freed up. Transplanting isn't really recommended for root vegetables like carrots or beets, so you'll have to direct sow those veggies, but it can definitely still be worth succession sowing those plants. Another tip is to plant duplicates so that if some of your plants in the garden end up getting diseased or attacked by pests, you can get them out of the garden early and replace them with some of those duplicate plants that you have going on in the background. Again, it's all about maximizing your garden space and avoiding waste in every way, so if you have those extra plants, in a pinch you can use them. And one last tip is to plant your plants wherever they seem to fit in. You can plan this out ahead of time, but I find it's more fun and beautiful to place the plants where they can fit in the garden and have a more diverse looking garden as a result. So instead of planting our second succession of lettuce right next to the first one, I decided to put them between our garlic plants where there was plenty of space for the time being. That way when it's harvested and the garlic comes out of the garden, we'll have a nice big open plot to replace them with other plants. Succession planting is really simple, but it's so important to making sure that you're making the most of your garden and getting lots of fresh produce. Let me know if you have any additional tips when it comes to succession planting, and thanks so much for watching Geeky Greenhouse. I'll see you next time.